Chapter 5 of The Man with the Red Beard by David Whitelaw. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne. Chapter 5. Redbeard Again. I cannot say the number of times that business or pleasure has taken me to the French capital, and I have seen the fickle city under all manner of conditions, but never have I felt so depressed as when I walked out of the Gare du Nord on the morning after I left Winson at Charing Cross Station. The passage had been atrocious. A southeasterly gale, charged with grape-shot of sleet, had whipped the vessel as she ploughed across the channel. The heating apparatus in the French train had been apparently out of order, and I had slept but little. Also, I remember, perhaps a trivial matter in itself, that a smut from the engine had entered my eye as I got out to get a cup of coffee at Achmed. Never did man feel less like a knight-errant than I did, as I walked through the grey streets to my hotel. Paris was awakening to life. The work-girls were besieging the long omnibuses, waiters were polishing the tables outside the cafes, and rag-pickers were rummaging hopefully in garbage-barrels. The great two-decked Montrouge trams grunted and clanged from their starting-place at the Gare de l'Est, and a thin steam of great-coated suburbans filed out of the station. There had been a little snow, for the roofs of the houses were covered with a thin layer of white, while the pavements were coated with a grey slush, half frozen, and which made walking a hazardous feat. I had chosen to walk to my hotel in the hope that the exercise would perhaps instil a little life into my cramped feet, but the slow and careful steps I was forced to take I found were not conducive to this. I hailed a fiacre and continued my journey within its chilly comfort. I began to curse myself for a fool. This taking up of a stranger's burden was no business for a hard-working journalist. I told myself that Don Quixote himself would have jibbed at the job I had embarked on. I thought quite seriously of abandoning the affair. I said that after I had rested I would breakfast and call upon Paul's brother, and hand him over the £1,000 and full particulars of the case. After all, this was a thing in which the man's family surely had the right to act before a stranger. Then I said that I would dine at Maxim's, spend the evening at the Olympia, and return to London to-morrow. I am afraid a man with cold feet, a cinder in his eye, and after a sleepless night, is far from being the flower of chivalry. It was not until I had bathed and lay between the sheets in a warm room on the second floor of my hotel that I began to feel more normal, and in my dreams I again saw the oval face with the dark bands of hair and the grey eyes. I do not remember what was the nature of my dream, but my first waking thoughts were of Myra Ramsay. I sat up in bed. I had drawn the blinds to exclude the daylight, and now between the slats a bright winter sun was sending his message. The musical roar of the city came up to me, and I leapt from the sheets and pulled aside the blinds. Sun-bathed streets, bustling, happy people. There was no sign of winter now, except where on the glistening roofs were little patches of white in the shadows of chimney-stacks where the sun had not as yet penetrated. The Boulevard Sebastopol ran beneath me, a long line of moving people and vehicles showing through the bare arms of the trees on either side. This, I said, could hardly be the same morning on which I had crawled on frozen feet out of the Gare du Nord. I looked at my watch, and saw that it wanted but 1:15. I rang the bell and ordered my coffee and rolls, and asked the man to put a match to my gas-stove. Beside the coffee-pot, on the tray the waiter brought up, and arranged upon a little table by the fire, was a copy of Le Matin. I searched its columns eagerly in the hope that I might come across something related to Paul Bergstoff's arrest. It was barely mentioned. Evidently the Parisian public had little interest in the affair as yet. I again felt the sense of power, as I thought what they would say if they knew what I knew. It was a romance that would be hugged to the heart of the loungers on the boulevards, and which would take Paris by storm. At 3 o'clock I was walking up the Boulevard Saint-Michel in my quest for Paul's brother. The adventure had again renewed its grip upon my sense of romance, and I felt quite ashamed of myself for the thoughts of the morning. The house I call 404A is a tall, narrow building overlooking the gardens of the Luxembourg. I will state here that you will look in vain to find 404A on the Boulevard Miche, for there is no such number. Neither is there a Paul Bergstoff, nor a Sir Boris Fenberg, nor a Winson. Neither is the writer to be found in the London Directory by the name of Samuel Mannering. These persons all exist, as do the others in this story, but not by the names they are known by here. As the events unfold themselves The reason for this, I think, will be quite plain. 404A, Boulevard Saint-Michel, then, was, as I have said, a tall, narrow building overlooking the Luxembourg Gardens. The shop on the ground floor was occupied by a tobacconist and vendor of state lottery tickets, and admission to the upper part of the house was by means of a small side door, which was, I think, the narrowest door I have ever seen. An equally narrow staircase showed across the gloom of a dingy hallway, and seemed to lead up into eternal darkness. Evidently, I said, the relatives of Paul Bergstoff were not blessed with the good things of this world. By the little light which struggled through the dirt of a tiny window on the landing above, I referred to Paul's letter, and saw that my destination was higher up. I looked round. On the wall was the notice "Troisième étage." So, I said, I had arrived. There were but 2 doors on the landing, and I knocked on that on my right hand, and almost immediately that on my left was opened. One glance told me that the man who stood before me was the brother or near relation of the man I had seen shot in the motor. There was the same shape to the face, the same setting to the eyes, only Bernard was not so dark as Paul. I inclined my head and spoke in French. "Monsieur Bergstoff?" The other bowed, but I noticed that he did not throw open the door. Rather, I imagined he held it so that I should not see within the room. "You are Monsieur Mannering?" he queried, in his turn, and he looked at me suspiciously. For answer I took out one of my cards and held it out to him. He took it, and as he read, a look of welcome came into his eyes. All suspicion went from them, and instead I was looking into a face full of good humour. "You will come inside," he said, holding the door wide for me to enter. "My brother wrote that you might call, but I did not look for you so soon." He took a letter from the table, and I saw it bore the heading of the Barbarians' Club. He held it out to me, and, reading, I was surprised to see that Paul mentioned nothing of his danger except in general terms. Perhaps he had had good reasons. Again, he might not have had the time. The work before me was rather difficult. "Then you have not heard," I began. "Paul did not write that—" Bernard Bergstoff looked at me sharply. "Paul is in danger. Is he ill?" "Ill? Yes. Very ill, Monsieur Bergstoff. It is a question whether he is alive." And I told him in detail the events of 2 evenings since. He heard me through to the bitter end, his great eyes fixed on my face in such a way that had I been, for any cause, telling him a lie, I must have broken down. And when I had finished he was silent for a moment or two, his head buried in his hands. There was a huskiness in his voice when at last he spoke. "You must forgive my emotion, monsieur. He was my only brother. He has perhaps told you of our father's fate. Paul was all I had. You know, the cause in which he and I lived, a cause of danger and sudden death. We all expect it, but when it does come it is hard to bear." He turned from me and stood moodily looking out of the window, out over the leafless trees. I liked the fellow. He had something of the same attraction that Paul had held for me. I did not break into his thoughts, but sat on the chair he had handed me and looked around the room. The interior of the apartment was far more comfortable than the approach to it led one to expect. A bright fire burnt in the grate, and upon the table were the remnants of déjeuner. I noticed that the half-empty bottle beside the plate bore the label of a good vintage. The walls were papered grey-green, and a few photographs hung on them, Russian scenes for the most part. Above the mantelpiece the grave eyes of Leo Tolstoy looked out from a black and gold frame. Books there were in profusion, not ranged on shelves, but in disorder about the room, where their reader had put them down. Here, I said, were books that were read, not looked upon as merely furniture. One corner of the room was curtained off, and behind a gap in the cloth I caught a glimpse of what might be a workroom. There were the shadowy forms of retorts and bottles, but even as I looked Bernard Bergstoff crossed the room and drew the curtains closely together. There was nothing offensive in the action. It was done with the air of one who arranges an untidy thing, such as a crooked picture on the wall. But I was not deceived. "But we do not let the death or arrest of our members delay the work we have in hand," he went on. "This is a stirring time for Russia. Engaged as she is with external foes, there is more chance for us to work for her regeneration from the inside. In what way, monsieur, can I help you?" I came to the point at once. "It refers to Miss Ramsay. Your brother has heard, I think, from you, that she is in prison, and has entrusted me with a large sum to help her, and, if possible, to procure her release and take her back to England. to her friends, and, if he lives, to Paul." Bernard Bergstoff laughed, a harsh little chuckle. "You are a bold man, Monsieur Mannerling, to enter the lists against the Tsar." "I know Russia well, and as an Englishman I may have a chance. I have many friends there. Besides, I may be selfish. Remember, I am a newspaper man. There will be much to write of." I was answered by the fatalist lifting of the shoulders, such as I had noticed Paul use. "I feel," Bergstoff said, "that I should not let you take this in your hands, but I am known in Russia. I could do little. But together—" "You mean you would come to Russia?" "Certainly, monsieur. I say that together we might fight Paul's battles. I, too, have a mission. Although we do not allow the cause to suffer by these happenings, there is no law against private vengeance. Pardon me, you will drink a glass of wine, monsieur?" But I declined, asking him instead to take a walk in the gardens where we could talk over our projects. It was imperative that what was to be done should be done quickly. It was very pleasant among the great bare trees, through which one caught glimpses of the buildings and the moving world of Paris. We spoke of ways and means, and my companion told me many things of his circle, and of Myra Ramsay. From his description I imagined she was like the lady of my dreams. About 5 o'clock we entered the Café Horcotte to drink an absinthe before we parted. We sat at a table just within the door, facing the boulevard, behind the great pane of plate glass. There were but few people on the chairs outside, and it was perhaps that which made Bergstoff take particular note of two men who sat almost in the corner. He drew my attention to one of them, a man in a fur coat, with a thin, cruel face and sharp-pointed beard, long and grey. He was talking excitedly to his companion, whose face was beyond the range of our vision, being behind one of those tree-like shrubs which seem to be essential to the well-being of continental restaurants. Bergstoff told me of the grey-bearded man. He was, he said, General Eliza, a high official in the Russian police, who made his headquarters in Paris. There was nothing to be alarmed at. He was evidently there at the same time as we, purely by coincidence, and his visit had no connection with Bergstoff, who, as a Russian revolutionary in Paris, was well known to him. But my companion was by nature careful, and he did not wish to awaken the interest of General Eliza on the eve of a departure which he wished to keep as secret as possible. He whispered an appointment with me for the morning, and left the café by the side door leading into the Place de la Sorbonne, leaving me to finish my absinthe and take stock of a personality with whom I might possibly have further dealings. I studied the face of General Eliza till I think I knew every cruel line of it. Suddenly I saw him finish his glass and button up his coat. As he rose from the table, his companion rose also. I saw him for an instant only, and at the first sight I dropped my head, fearing recognition. For the man who in that moment stood revealed by the lights of the café was the man with the red beard I had seen so recently in London, and with whose affairs I seemed to be so strangely mixed up. When I next raised my head, the two men were walking away towards the Seine, arm linked affectionately in arm. End of chapter 5.